Helmets on! All right, men, listen up! Yes, sir! Move out, now!
September 1944. Third Army has raced 400 miles across France in just 30 days. From Normandy to the German border in 1 month, an advance that military theorists said was impossible. Now Patton's columns are approaching the Reich itself, the first time American forces would set foot on German soil since the war began. In just over 2 weeks, First Army would beat them across, but Third Army soldiers believed they would be first. The competition between American armies was as fierce as the fight against the Germans. When Third Army finally crossed into Germany, the soldiers' reactions revealed something unexpected. They weren't celebrating. They were exhausted, low on fuel, and increasingly frustrated that their spectacular advance had been halted by supply problems rather than enemy resistance. What Third Army soldiers said when they entered Germany wasn't, "We beat everyone here." It was, "Why did we stop?" This is the story of the greatest advance of the war and the men who executed it, based on letters, diaries, and documented statements from the soldiers who fought their way to the German frontier. On August 1st, 1944, Third Army became operational in Normandy under Patton's command. Within days, his forces were racing in multiple directions, west into Brittany, south toward the Loire, east toward Paris, and north to help trap German forces in the Falaise pocket.
Men, the enemy is close. Stay sharp, stay together. Move out of my signal. Soldaten, der Feind rückt vor. Wir müssen sofort handeln. Haltet die Linie jeden Preis.
The speed of advance was unprecedented. Third Army wasn't just moving fast. It was covering distances that rendered German defensive planning obsolete before it could be implemented. Soldiers who had fought through the Norman hedgerows suddenly found themselves in open country, where American advantages in mobility and firepower could be fully exploited. The soldiers' initial reactions to this sudden mobility were captured in letters home and diary entries that survived the war. One tank commander from the 4th Armored Division wrote to his family describing the advance as unlike anything he had experienced in training or previous combat. He stated they were moving so fast that maps became outdated before they could be properly studied. Towns that appeared on their operational maps as objectives were already in American hands by the time units received orders to capture them. Infantry soldiers riding on tanks to keep pace with armored columns expressed mixed feelings about the rapid advance. Some welcomed the speed because it meant less time under enemy fire and fewer casualties than static warfare. Others worried that moving too fast created vulnerabilities, long supply lines, exposed flanks, and units becoming separated from supporting formations. One sergeant from the 80th Infantry Division wrote in his diary that his company had advanced 30 miles in a single day, bypassing German strongpoints that follow-on units would have to reduce. The competition between American armies became apparent almost immediately. Third Army soldiers were aware that other American and British forces were also racing across France. Patton made no secret of his desire to beat everyone to Paris, to the Rhine, and ultimately to Berlin. He told his staff repeatedly that Third Army had two enemies, the Germans and other Allied headquarters that might slow their advance. This competitive spirit filtered down through the ranks. Soldiers took pride in their division's reputation for speed and aggressive action, but the rapid advance also created severe logistical strain. Armored divisions consumed enormous quantities of fuel. A single division required 73,000 gallons just to move 100 miles. Third Army had multiple armored divisions racing simultaneously in different directions. The logistics system designed to support these operations was the Red Ball Express, a dedicated trucking operation that moved supplies forward from Normandy beaches. At its peak, 6,000 trucks operated around the clock on one-way routes stretching hundreds of miles. Yet consumption exceeded delivery, and fuel shortages were inevitable. By late August, soldiers began noticing the logistical problems. Tank crews watched their fuel gauges drop to critical levels. Artillery units conserved ammunition because resupply convoys were delayed. Maintenance crews struggled to keep vehicles running with declining stocks of spare parts. One tank platoon leader wrote that his unit had stopped, not because of German resistance, but because they literally ran out of gas. His tanks sat immobilized for 3 days waiting for fuel trucks to reach their position. The advance toward Paris showcased both Third Army's capabilities and its challenges. Elements of Third Army reached the outskirts of Paris in late August, but the honor of liberating the city was given to Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc. American soldiers who had raced across France to reach Paris expressed frustration that they were being held back for political reasons. They understood the symbolic importance of French forces liberating their own capital, but after weeks of continuous combat and rapid movement, some felt their accomplishment was not receiving proper recognition. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. The celebration was genuine and moving. French civilians poured into streets embracing American soldiers, offering food and wine, expressing gratitude that made the hardships of combat seem worthwhile. But Third Army soldiers interviewed by war correspondents during the liberation made clear they were not stopping in Paris. Their objective remained the German border and ultimately Berlin. The liberation of Paris was significant, but for Third Army it was a waypoint rather than a destination. By early September 1944, Third Army's spectacular advance ground to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because there was no fuel. The numbers told a brutal story. On August 31st, Third Army received just 32,000 gallons of fuel, barely enough to move one armored division 25 miles. Patton had requested 400,000 gallons, the amount he calculated would allow continued advance to the Rhine. The shortfall was not a temporary problem. It reflected fundamental limitations of the Allied logistics system that would persist for months. The soldiers' reactions to the fuel crisis revealed growing frustration with what they perceived as poor strategic decisions by higher command. Letters and diary entries from this period expressed anger that their advance had been stopped by supply problems rather than enemy action. One infantry officer wrote that his battalion had fought from Normandy to the Meuse River without being stopped by Germans, only to be halted by lack of fuel for supporting tanks. He questioned why logistics had not been better prepared for the rapid advance everyone knew was possible after the Normandy breakout. Tank crews experienced the fuel crisis most directly. Armored vehicles immobilized for lack of fuel became sitting targets for German artillery and air attacks. Crews had to establish defensive positions around their disabled vehicles while waiting for resupply that might take days to arrive. One tank commander described the psychological impact of sitting immobilized within sight of the German border, knowing that if they had fuel they could be across the Rhine before German defenses could be organized. The competition between American armies for limited fuel supplies created tensions that filtered down to soldier level. Third Army troops learned that fuel they needed was being allocated to Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group for Operation Market Garden. Soldiers who had fought continuously since Normandy resented that British forces, whom they perceived as slower and more cautious, were receiving supply priority. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, embedded with Third Army during this period, documented soldiers' complaints about what they considered unfair allocation decisions. Patton made his frustration clear to anyone who would listen, and his attitude influenced how soldiers understood their situation. According to witnesses who heard him, Patton told General Omar Bradley that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. He argued that every day of delay allowed Germans to strengthen defenses and would cost American lives later when those same German units had to be fought from prepared positions. Soldiers heard these arguments from their own officers and agreed with them. But not all soldiers blamed logistics or high command for the halt. Some recognized that the advance had been unsustainably fast, and that pausing to consolidate was militarily prudent regardless of supply issues. One company commander wrote to his family that while he understood soldiers' frustration, he believed the halt actually benefited Third Army by allowing exhausted troops to rest, damaged equipment to be repaired, and replacements to join depleted units. He noted that continuous combat from Normandy had reduced some rifle companies to half strength. The pause also gave soldiers time to process what they had accomplished. In just 30 days, Third Army had advanced 400 miles, liberated territory containing millions of French civilians, destroyed multiple German divisions, and captured tens of thousands of prisoners. The scale of achievement was unprecedented in modern warfare. Yet soldiers interviewed during early September expressed less satisfaction about what they had accomplished than frustration about what they believed they could still accomplish if given adequate supplies. The German border was visible from forward American positions. Soldiers could see the fortifications of the Siegfried Line in the distance. Intelligence reports indicated that German defenses were still being organized and that breakthrough might be possible if Third Army attacked immediately. The opportunity seemed obvious to soldiers who had spent weeks exploiting German disorganization. The fact that they were being forced to wait while that opportunity disappeared created resentment that would persist throughout the autumn campaign. When Third Army finally crossed into Germany in mid-September 1944, the moment lacked the drama soldiers had anticipated. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches, no sense that history was being made. The first American soldiers to cross the German frontier in Third Army's sector did so during routine patrol operations, barely noticing they had left France until they saw German-language signs and different architectural styles in border villages. The anticlimax reflected both the soldiers' exhaustion and their focus on tactical objectives rather than symbolic milestones. First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges had beaten Third Army across the German border by several days, entering Germany on September 12th. Patton noted to his wife in a letter that he feared he was off the first pages of newspapers for the moment. This competitive disappointment filtered down through Third Army ranks. Soldiers who had believed they would be first into Germany felt their achievement was diminished by being second. Some blamed the fuel shortage that had halted their advance in late August. Others blamed higher command decisions that allocated resources to other operations. But the emotional impact of entering enemy territory was significant, regardless of whether Third Army was first. Soldiers' letters and diary entries from mid-September reveal complex feelings about setting foot on German soil. For many, crossing into Germany represented the culmination of years of preparation and months of combat. They were now fighting in the homeland of the enemy who had started the war. The psychological weight of that realization affected different soldiers in different ways. Some soldiers expressed grim satisfaction at bringing war to Germany after years of German forces occupying other countries. One infantry private wrote to his family that he felt no sympathy for German civilians who complained about damage from combat operations. He stated that Germans should have thought about consequences before starting a war. This attitude reflected anger many American soldiers felt about what they had witnessed in France: destroyed towns, displaced civilians, and evidence of German occupation brutality. Other soldiers expressed more complex feelings. One officer wrote in his diary that entering Germany felt different from liberating France. In France, American forces had been welcomed as liberators by grateful civilians. In Germany, they were invaders in enemy territory. German civilians who remained in border villages showed fear rather than gratitude. This created psychological discomfort for some soldiers who had to balance their role as combat soldiers with their values as Americans who did not see themselves as conquerors. The physical condition of German border villages provided soldiers with their first direct look at how the war had affected German civilians. Many border areas had been evacuated by German authorities, leaving ghost towns that American forces occupied without opposition. But some civilians remained, usually elderly people or families with young children who had nowhere else to go. Soldiers' descriptions of these encounters reveal attempts to maintain professional conduct while fighting in enemy territory. Third Army soldiers also noticed immediately that fighting in Germany was different from fighting in France. German soldiers defending their own territory fought with determination that exceeded what American forces had faced during the pursuit across France. Casualties increased as German resistance stiffened. One battalion commander noted in his after-action report that his unit suffered more casualties in 1 week of fighting along the German border than in 3 weeks of pursuit operations across France. The Siegfried Line fortifications presented challenges that soldiers had not encountered since the Norman hedgerows. The concrete bunkers and Dragon's Teeth anti-tank obstacles required deliberate operations rather than the rapid exploitation Third Army had conducted across France. Engineers working to breach obstacles came under fire from positions they could not locate. Infantry advancing through fortified zones faced interlocking fields of fire from multiple bunkers. The combat was grinding and costly. Soldiers' morale during this period reflected the transition from mobile warfare to attritional fighting. Letters home expressed less optimism about quick victory than had been common during the August advance. Some soldiers wrote that they now expected the war to continue through winter, and possibly into 1945. The realization that months of additional combat lay ahead affected soldier psychology in ways that officers noted with concern. From September through November 1944, Third Army became bogged down in the Lorraine region of northeastern France and the approaches to the Siegfried Line. What soldiers said during this period revealed frustration, exhaustion, and growing realization that the spectacular advance of August would not be repeated. The Lorraine campaign became Patton's bloodiest and least successful operation of the war, and soldiers' statements reflected the human cost of attritional warfare. The fortress city of Metz exemplified the challenges Third Army faced. Built over centuries and modernized by Germans after 1871, Metz consisted of 43 forts surrounding the city, all constructed with reinforced concrete and positioned for mutually supporting fire. Attacking these fortifications violated every principle Patton had emphasized during the August advance: speed, exploitation, bypassing strongpoints. But Metz could not be bypassed because it commanded the Moselle River crossings and road network Third Army needed for continued advance. Soldiers attacking Metz expressed deep frustration with operations that seemed to contradict everything they had learned about Third Army's operational methods. One infantry captain wrote in a letter that his company was being ordered to conduct frontal assaults against concrete bunkers that withstood artillery bombardment. He stated that such operations produced casualties without achieving significant results, and questioned why better approaches were not employed. His company lost 32 men in one day of fighting for Fort Dryant, a strong point that would not fall until November. The weather added to soldiers' misery. Autumn rains turned roads to mud that immobilized vehicles and made infantry movement exhausting. Soldiers wrote about standing in flooded foxholes for hours, unable to dry their uniforms or warm themselves. Trench foot became a serious medical problem, with some units losing more men to cold weather injuries than to enemy action. One soldier wrote to his family that he had not been dry or warm for 2 weeks, and that the conditions reminded him of descriptions his father had given of World War I trench warfare. Tank crews found the Lorraine campaign particularly frustrating because terrain and weather negated many advantages armored forces normally enjoyed. Muddy conditions limited mobility. Dense fog prevented effective fire at range. German anti-tank defenses were well positioned and difficult to locate until after they had fired. One tank platoon leader wrote that his unit lost 2 Shermans in one day to German anti-tank guns they never saw. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy you could not see wore on soldiers who had become accustomed to American advantages in firepower and technology. The casualty rates during the Lorraine campaign sobered soldiers who had begun believing Third Army was unstoppable. Combat units that had fought from Normandy with relatively light losses suffered heavily during attritional fighting around Metz and in the Vosges Mountains. One regimental history noted that the unit suffered more casualties in October 1944 than in any other month of the war. Soldiers saw friends killed or wounded in operations that produced minimal territorial gains. The human cost of the campaign was evident in every letter soldiers wrote home. But soldiers also demonstrated remarkable resilience during this difficult period. Despite frustration with operations, poor weather, and high casualties, Third Army units continued attacking when ordered. Officers noted that soldiers maintained discipline and cohesion even under conditions that tested morale. One battalion commander wrote in his after-action report that while his men complained about conditions and operations, they still performed their duties with professionalism that reflected well on their training and leadership. The arrival of replacement soldiers presented challenges for veteran units. New soldiers lacked combat experience and often joined units just before major attacks. Veterans had to incorporate these replacements while conducting operations, creating additional stress for small unit leaders. Some veteran soldiers expressed resentment about inexperienced replacements whose mistakes could get people killed. One squad leader wrote that he spent more time teaching new soldiers basic tactics than he spent fighting Germans. By late November, Third Army had captured Metz after nearly 3 months of operations. The victory was genuine but costly. Soldiers' reactions to the capture revealed less celebration than relief that the operation was finally over. They recognized that capturing Metz was necessary, but resented the casualties required to achieve it. One company that had fought from Normandy to Metz had lost 70% of its original personnel to casualties and rotation. The turnover affected unit cohesion and accumulated combat wisdom. On December 19, 1944, Patton sat in an emergency conference at Verdun called by Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. 3 days earlier, German forces had launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, creating a crisis that threatened Allied strategic plans. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly Third Army could disengage from current operations, turn 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton's answer, that he could attack in 3 days with 3 divisions, shocked everyone present. What followed would demonstrate everything Third Army soldiers had learned about rapid movement and aggressive action. The soldiers' reactions to the sudden change in operations revealed the flexibility and responsiveness that characterized Third Army. Units received orders to disengage from positions they had been defending for weeks, move north in winter conditions, and immediately attack German forces in the Bulge salient. The logistical complexity was staggering, but soldiers executed the movement with efficiency that vindicated their training and leadership. One regimental operations officer wrote that his unit moved 150 miles in 24 hours, arriving at attack positions with minimal confusion. The advance toward Bastogne tested Third Army soldiers under conditions worse than anything they had experienced since Normandy. Winter weather was brutal. Snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures that caused equipment failures and cold weather casualties. Roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the German offensive, and American units moving to defensive positions. German resistance was determined because Wehrmacht forces understood the strategic importance of the offensive. Yet Third Army maintained pressure, attacking every day despite weather and resistance that might have stopped other formations. Soldiers' letters and statements from this period reveal pride in what they were accomplishing combined with recognition of the operation's difficulty. One tank commander wrote that his crew had not slept more than 2 hours at a time for 4 days, but was maintaining the advance because they knew American forces at Bastogne were depending on them. This sense of urgency motivated soldiers to continue attacking despite exhaustion and casualties. On December 26th, lead elements of Third Army's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and made contact with defenders at Bastogne. The relief became one of the most celebrated operations of the war. Soldiers who participated took pride in what they had achieved, pivoting an entire army 90 degrees and attacking in winter conditions within 72 hours, exactly as Patton had promised. One officer wrote that the relief of Bastogne proved what Third Army could accomplish when properly led and supplied. But the Battle of the Bulge continued through January as American forces pushed German units back toward their start lines. Third Army soldiers fought in the worst winter conditions of the war, suffering casualties from both enemy action and weather. The combat was as intense as anything they had experienced in Normandy or Lorraine. Yet soldiers maintained offensive pressure, demonstrating resilience that reflected both their training and their confidence in Third Army's leadership. The soldiers' statements about Patton during and after the Battle of the Bulge revealed complex attitudes toward their commander. Many expressed genuine admiration for his aggressive leadership and ability to maintain operational tempo regardless of conditions. They recognized that Patton drove them hard, but believed his methods saved lives by keeping German forces off balance. One infantry sergeant wrote that soldiers might complain about Patton, but they trusted him to use them effectively, rather than wasting their lives in poorly planned operations. Others expressed more critical views based on their experience during the Lorraine campaign. Some soldiers believed Patton's aggressive instincts sometimes led to operations that produced casualties without commensurate gains. They respected his battlefield accomplishments but questioned decisions that seemed to prioritize speed over soldier welfare. These more nuanced assessments reflected combat veterans' ability to distinguish between successful operations and those that could have been conducted with less cost. What Third Army soldiers said when they entered Germany and throughout the subsequent campaigns revealed men who understood they were part of something historically significant, but who experienced that history through the grinding reality of combat operations. They took pride in Third Army's accomplishments, the race across France, the relief of Bastogne, the ultimate victory in Europe, but they also understood the human cost of those achievements in ways that official histories could not fully capture. Their statements, preserved in letters, diaries, and interviews, provide insight into how American soldiers experienced the final year of the war in Europe and what they thought about the leadership, operations, and events that defined that experience.